section, we'll be taking a look at the requirements for school plans. So the spirit and the intent behind the SPSA is a cycle of continuous improvement. It's an ongoing cyclical process in which schools engage in strategic planning with educational partners based on a comprehensive needs assessment, implement evidence-based interventions, and evaluate outcomes and progress toward goals in an overall effort to improve the educational programs and student achievement at the school. And school-level SPSA development should also be in alignment with the district-level LCAP process, which will be touched on later in this presentation. So which schools must develop a school plan? So as Adrian mentioned, the Every Student Succeeds Act requires schools receiving Title I funds and operating a school-wide program to develop a school plan. Schools identified for CSI, TSI, or ATSI under ESSA are also required to develop and implement a school improvement plan. However, Education Code 64001 allows the SPSA to serve as the school improvement plan that's required under federal law for schools identified for CSI, TSI, or ATSI. Additionally, a local governing board or body of an LEA may require its schools to complete a school plan, even if one is not required. There are a number of legal requirements for school plans at both the state and the federal level. And Assembly Bill 716 revised Education Code to streamline and align state and federal planning processes and codified federal ESSA school planning requirements in Education Code Section 64001. And for your reference, we've included a handout that highlights the alignment of state and federal school planning requirements. And so you can see the link to the handout on the slide. When certifying the CONAP, LEAs must ensure that the SPSA meets the legal requirements, that the school site council has developed and approved the SPSA for each school participating in programs funded through the CONAP, and that SPSAs were developed with the review, certification, and advice of the School English Learner Advisory Committee, or ELAC, if an ELAC is required. Education Code also requires that SPSAs be reviewed and approved by the governing board or body of the LEA at a regularly scheduled meeting whenever there are material changes. It's important to note that Education Code does not define material changes. This is something that needs to be defined at the local level. Any change in budget and related program services that might raise questions for your educational partners should be considered material. And also, a 10% budget change in a line item is typically used as a rule of thumb for determining what constitutes a material change. So Education Code 64001 specifies that the development of the school plan shall include the administration of a comprehensive needs assessment and the identification of the process for evaluating and monitoring the plan. Since the school site council is responsible for the development of the school plan, the school site council must be involved in the needs assessment and the evaluation and monitoring of the plan. And your school site council meeting minutes should reflect their involvement in both of these components. The required content of school plans must include goals, evidence-based strategies, actions, or services, and proposed expenditures. The SPSA goals must address the needs of students and student groups based on the findings of the comprehensive needs assessment. And the strategies, actions, and services included in the plan must be evidence-based and aligned to the needs that were determined through the needs assessment process. The SPSA must also include proposed expenditures to address the findings of the needs assessment. And that includes any resource inequities that were identified through this process. Essentially, everything should align to the comprehensive needs assessment, which is why it's considered the foundation of the school plan. And we'll be taking a deeper look at the comprehensive needs assessment process later in this presentation. The SPSA is a one-year plan that's intended to be developed by the school site council and approved by the LEA's local governing board or body before or during the school year for which the plan is implemented. Now, statute does not specify a timeline or a deadline for the development and the approval of the SPSA. This is a local decision based on your local context and needs. However, please keep in mind that for schools identified for CSI, ATSI, and TSI, the CDE has indicated that the expectation is that the school plan is fully developed and approved by the school and the LEA by the first day of the school year, so that students and the school receive a full year of intervention and supports. And so on the slide, we've also included some planning considerations to think about when determining your LEA's SPSA timeline. So for example, one consideration might be when schools receive information about budgets that will allow them to plan for the proposed expenditures. So although there's no required timeline or deadline, it's really important to remember that you must have an approved plan in place in order to expend Title I funds. And so again, there's no required timeline for the SPSA development and approval, but here we just wanted to share a sample timeline. And so this sample timeline highlights a spring cycle in which the SPSA is developed and approved in the spring of the previous year so that the plan is in place and ready to be implemented by the start of the school year. In this sample timeline, you can see that the implementation and monitoring of the current plan begins at the start of the school year and continues throughout the year. And then planning and development of the 2025-26 plan would begin in the winter and spring, with the plan being approved by the school site council and local governing board by June. Many LEAs have shifted to a spring SPSA cycle to align with their LCAP development process. If your LEA has a fall or a winter SPSA development cycle, the important thing to remember is that schools must have an approved plan in place in order to spend Title I funds. And another important thing to remember is that if your SPSAs are developed and approved based on preliminary Title I allocations or budget estimates, which most LEAs do, then your plan will need to be revised to align with the final CONAP allocations, which are typically available in January or February through the winter CONAP release. The CDE has developed optional SPSA templates that schools may use depending on the school. And there are 4 templates available. One designed to meet school-wide planning requirements, as well as templates available to meet the federal CSI, ATSI, and TSI planning requirements. Now, there is no required template that schools must use for the SPSA. It is a local decision as to which template you use. Just keep in mind that if you're not using one of the CDE SPSA templates, you'll need to ensure that the template you are using meets the SPSA legal requirements. Also, keep in mind that the process of developing the SPSA is equally important, and a school will need to maintain evidence of this process, and that includes the comprehensive needs assessment, development and approval by the school site council, evidence of input from your ELAC, and the annual evaluation process. And these requirements are also reviewed through the FPM process. Now, the next few slides are only applicable to single school districts and charter schools. So Education Code 64001J allows for single school districts and charter schools to use the LCAP to serve as the SPSA as long as the plan meets federal school planning requirements and the stakeholder requirements established in Ed Code Section 52062A, and the plan is adopted at a public hearing. So some things to keep in mind when determining whether or not this option would best support your needs are that your Title I funded actions and budgeted expenditures would need to be included in the LCAP. Schools would need to demonstrate in the LCAP how Title I funded actions are based on a comprehensive needs assessment to support students furthest away from achieving the standards. And the additional LCAP stakeholder requirements specified in Education Code 52062A would need to be met. So single school districts and charter schools basically have two options: either combine the LCAP and the SPSA or keep them as two separate documents. So for option one, if you choose to use the LCAP as your SPSA, you would have one plan, the LCAP, which would also serve as your SPSA. And so for this option, as mentioned, all federal school planning requirements for SPSAs must be included within the LCAP. So that would include your Title I funded actions and budgeted expenditures. Also, a school site council is not required if using the LCAP as your SPSA. Instead, you would follow the LCAP consultation requirements. So for charter schools, this includes consulting with teachers, principals, administrators, other school personnel, parents, and students when developing the LCAP. And the additional stakeholder requirements that are triggered if using the LCAP as your SPSA are that you would need to establish a parent advisory committee. And the draft LCAP would need to be presented to that committee for review and comment. And a response would need to be provided in writing to the committee's comments. You would also need to establish an English Learner Parent Advisory Committee if you have an enrollment of at least 15% English learners and at least 50 English learners. And your DLAC could serve as your English Learner Parent Advisory Committee. The draft LCAP would also need to be presented to the EL Parent Advisory Committee or DLAC for review and comment. And again, a response would need to be provided in writing to the committee's comments. You would be required to notify the public of the opportunity to submit written comments regarding proposed actions and expenditures in the LCAP. And you would also need to consult with your Special Education Local Plan Area Administrator, or SELPA, in the development of the plan. Next slide. The CDE has developed a number of resources for single school districts and charter schools opting to use the LCAP to meet SPSA requirements. And so they have a SPSA LCAP planning summary, also a CSI planning summary, and then a TSI ATSI planning summary. These planning summaries explain how to use the LCAP to meet SPSA requirements for the school-wide program, CSI, TSI, or ATSI planning requirements as applicable to the school. And the planning summaries provide examples of where in the LCAP the federal requirements may be addressed. With option 2, if you choose not to use your LCAP as your SPSA, then you would have two separate plans. You would have your LCAP and then your SPSA. For the development of the LCAP, you would need to consult with the required groups, which again for charter schools includes teachers, principals, administrators, other school personnel, parents, and students. And with this option, a school site council is required for the development of the SPSA. So again, for single school districts or charter schools, you have the flexibility to determine which option would best support your site's needs.